Welcome to the second overview for Yara's Crossing. My name is Diana Pomeroy. I'm an artist, I'm an author, and I'm an educator. And Yara's Crossing is my first self-published novel. You can find all the information to back the publication of this novel through Indiegogo in the description box below this video. And if you like the content of this video, feel free to like, to share, to subscribe, and to also, like I said, please check out the Indiegogo campaign in the description box. All it takes is $1 to contribute to this project, which has taken me about 2 to 3 decades of my life. So that said, we're going to learn a little bit more about the main character, Yara, in this video. So let's go ahead and get started. So Yara's story really begins when I was around 10 years old. And in the fourth grade, a lot of things were happening. In the movies and movie theaters, Jurassic Park had just been released, so 1993 or thereabouts. Jurassic Park and the sequel later on, The Lost World, were released. Also, video games were all the rage, so I had a Sega Genesis at home. I played Sonic the Hedgehog nonstop, and I was also obsessed with dinosaurs. So with both of these themes combined, I developed a piece of fan fiction that is called Jurassic Park 3 Raptor's Crusade. And this story emphasized the life and times of a dinosaur named Raptor. And she had just the typical classic raptor look, as the dinosaurs from Jurassic Park had. And this story that I started writing is something that I would continue to return to over the years. That Yara's story really started here with this work. And so on this slide, I've got several images from this story that I started writing when I was like I said, around 10 years old. I started writing this story. And we've got some pages from the book here, some illustrations that I made when I was a kid. And through these glimpses of the character Raptor, I started to really develop and hone this particular character. So I started to emphasize this one character repeatedly over the years of many different types of stories. And one of those stories, again, was later on going to be Yara's Crossing, but one of those stories that followed this Jurassic Park 3 story, my own version of Jurassic Park 3, by the way, dear Steven Spielberg and Universal, please don't come after me. What followed this story was The Adventures of Raptor, which was a comic series that I wrote. So in this comic series, The Adventures of Raptor, it was a 4-issue series that I started writing, and the 4 covers of those issues are shown here. So upper left, we've got the first issue, followed by the second, third, and fourth, all the way across the top row. And then below that, we've got some illustrations of the comic itself, some scenes from the comic that I drew. In each one of these stories, I illustrated and drew, in the summers off, in like 4th and 5th grade, when I was like 10, 11 years old, I started writing this story. And really, this is where I think the character Raptor started to come into her own as a character. She started to have some traits that I would carry over into later stories. And Raptor was basically the beginnings of what would later be Iara in Yara's Crossing. But she early on was written as a very self-assured character. Now, this story, of course, The Adventures of Raptor, is very anthropomorphized. So in this version, Raptor is very much like a person in her behavior and in her attributes and just the way that she talks, obviously. So she's going to change over time. You'll notice that, hopefully. And as I go over this with you, you'll notice just how much she changed, not just through her physical appearance, but also through her behavior. But in this comic series, again, this is where the seeds of this story began to take hold. And again, this started out, late 90s. So I started to really get into this series. And The Adventures of Raptor was meant to continue on in later stories. And that's basically what I did. So from the late 90s into the early 2000s, I took this comic series and I basically adapted it to a longer storyline. So I decided to take this longer storyline and decide to change it into something else. So this something else became this set of stories here. So on this side we have some more covers and illustrations from stories that I wrote in the late 90s all the way through the early 2000s. And this set of stories took on a darker tone than the Adventures of Raptor comic series. So where the Adventures of Raptor comic series was definitely more colorful and lighthearted and goofy, this series, this Emerald Green Eye series, and later on the new Adventures of Raptor, which would then become Yara's Crossing, the comic series. This set of stories is like the darker version. So if you want to think of it like a comparison with the Batman series, right? So in the 60s, the Batman TV show was absolutely goofy and campy and colorful and ridiculous. And later iterations of Batman, so like in the 90s, right? There was like still that goofiness, but it started to take on this edge. And that's basically where this set of stories sits, in that kind of energy where uh, Raptor starts to become more serious, and it's less of a story of, I gotta save all my friends to I gotta save myself. I have to survive in this environment, and I have to travel a great distance to reunite with a mentor. So I started to get into the hero's journey early on in Raptor's and eventually Yara's arc. I started to explore those kinds of themes and different archetypes began to emerge around this time. So again, this time frame, so late 90s, early 2000s, is when Raptor starts to basically evolve into the character that would eventually become Yara. So there's some additional characters here that I started to introduce in the Emerald Green Eyes series, including characters like Greenhoof and Fern and Glutron. And these dinosaurs make it into Yara's Crossing proper, the novel. Um, these characters do influence the story in some way. I'm not going to get into how just yet. We'll talk about that in later recordings. But basically, yeah, so Raptor had her origins. Yara really had her later twists and turns and origins here. And you'll notice in the lower images too, Raptor starts to get feathers. So in the early 2000s, I was keeping up with a lot of the paleontological literature, and I was starting to get into paleontology more seriously, potentially as a career path at this time. So I was not only getting more into the research aspects of dinosaur paleontology, but I was also getting into incorporating some of that into my illustrations and to improve their appearance. And so I started doing that. I started to research more into birds at this time as well, and I really started getting into coloration and what these creatures could have been like in life. And so um, it's here that during this time, early 2000s, that again Yara's story starts to form and also get a little bit grittier and a little bit darker, and that is actually where Yara's Crossing takes over. So here we have the cover of Yara's Crossing, the comic adaptation. This was written in about 2008. And during this time, when I wrote this comic, I was going through quite a bit. I was going through quite a bit in my academic career, I was going through quite a bit personally. And this comic series really it basically was like a version of Michael Crichton's stories. So versions, like a comic sort of version of maybe Jurassic Park mixed with Next, that kind of thing. I had kind of this dark iteration where, again, like think of this as like if we're paralleling like the Batman situation. Now we're getting into the 2000s version of Batman where it starts to get progressively darker. That's basically what happened here. Now, this comic version of Yara's Crossing is something that I will never publish. And the reason for that is because I feel that the way that I presented the content here was problematic. And it's problematic in the sense that I portrayed scientists as 100% evil. Like, not only did it fall under that trope, but also there was problematic content in terms of um, human extinction. And, the dinosaurs were retro engineered, they were brought back to life to aid in this process, in this storyline. And it was just considerably it's just legitimately an awful story that I started to write. And I was completely unhappy with it. When I was writing the comic, two things were happening. One, I was not happy with where the story was going. Two, I felt that there was just too much. The screenplays, the scripts for this were getting too long. The descriptions were getting too wordy, and the dialogue also. And I just felt that it just was not working. So the idea that I had in 2008 for Yara's Crossing, I shelved it. I shelved this character. I shelved the story. I just left it. And it was in the 2010s. I was working on my master's thesis, and so all of my creative energy basically went into that versus this story. But this story was always there in the back of my mind as I was working on my thesis. This story was something that I did tinker with here and there as I was working on that program. And so this character did not completely disappear. So Iara did not ever really go away. Just this story just kind of sat on the back burner for a while. And Yara's Crossing proper didn't fully start to get written as a novelization until the mid 2010s. So starting around 2014 or so. So in 2014 through, I would say 2014 through 2020 or 2021, for the next 6 years or so, I revisited Yara's Crossing. So I came back to that comic that I abandoned. I came back to this character. And I did a complete revamp. I did a complete redo of the story. I introduced some older characters that I had introduced in Emerald Green Eyes, which is Flash, who was originally a Jaguar character. And also in later iterations, the story was a Quetzal. So I'll get back into that character in another recording, another session. But Iara started to really come into her own, I feel, as a character here in this revision of Yara's Crossing. And so I actually started to publish Yara's Crossing online through several websites before the novel that you have that I'll be self-publishing in proper through Indiegogo. But prior to that publication, I started to publish just online chapters of this story. And it was a draft. It was a very rough draft, but it was a draft. And the story itself became very unwieldy very quickly. There were like 14, 15 chapters, and they were all very short. And the characterization, again, I wasn't exactly happy with. So around 2015, 2016, so from 2014 to 2016, I actually stopped writing the story again. I pulled it offline completely. I started to delve back into it once more, starting really around 2017, 2018. So really, Yara's Crossing as you know it, so as the novel is today, that story has been developed really since 2017. So Yara's Crossing, the final novel. So, there's always a joke among authors and artists that, whenever you do a file, you say final. Okay, basically. So that's basically what I did. This story has changed drastically over the past, just even the past decade. The way that Iara was characterized initially when I started writing her, she was essentially, for lack of a better term, codependent. She didn't have a voice, really. She was always subject to the whims of the other characters in the story initially when I wrote her. And she didn't have the inner strength. She didn't have the power that she does now. And so starting around 2017 through 2020, I completely revised who Yara was. And this journey that Yara takes, which is shown here in some of these concept illustrations, the story that she takes, it parallels my own. Now, it's not exactly my own, okay? This story is not autobiographical. This is not completely me, okay? One thing I want to clarify here. So Yara is, in a sense, just as all authors write characters that are a part of them, Yara is a part of me, but she is not 100% me as a person, okay? So she's, able to wield elemental magic, for example. She's able to communicate telepathically, for example. So there's some fun things that she has capabilities of. I'm not going to get into too much more than that, okay? But Iara has her own sense of power and strength, and there is a sense of magic about her in this story. And there's also hints in this storyline, callbacks to other forms of media that you are probably very familiar with, like maybe Disney films like The Lion King. There's callbacks to that. There's callbacks to Lord of the Rings, the 2000s films by Peter Jackson. There's callbacks, and also, of course, the novel by J.R.R. Tolkien. The series, excuse me. There's callbacks to Raptor Red as well, which was the emphasis for the very beginning when I started writing The Adventures of Raptor, the comic series. Raptor Red was a rival of Iara. In this version, no, okay? Raptor Red does not make a presence. No, but there's hints of that there. There's also hints of fossil finds, too, so there's some new fossil finds in Yara's Crossing that Yara comes across, and there's some really fun connections there. So if you are, again, interested in paleontology at all, if you have any kind of interest in that, I think you'll find that you'll really like this story, because there are parts of it that will, jump out at you if you're familiar with that. So let's move on to what Yara looks like now. I'm going to go over her character sheet a little bit and talk a bit more about this character and this story. So this is the official character sheet for Iara. This is in the book, so this is in the appendices. This is the very first page on the first appendix of Yara's Crossing, and this shows the growth stages of Yara over time, because basically that's what this story is about. Yara's Crossing is about her transformation from hatchling, just the cute little hatchling, completely innocent to the world, to fledgling that is awkward and unsure and frightened of pretty much everything, until adulthood, where she starts to come into her power and starts to recognize who she is. She is self-assured. She is strong. She is just a very powerful character, but she doesn't quite realize it. And other characters do pick up on that. And while Yara is a character that wants to be independent completely, she's not alone in this journey that she takes. And there is another character that decides to follow her on her journey and decides to be her main source of support throughout this entire story. and that character's name is Tlactok. And next time, I'm going to be telling you more about that character, how that character originated. I'll give you a hint. His story actually began with Yara's in the 90s. So his story actually begins way before the current iteration. So just as Yara has a very long history in my stories and in my past, so too does Tlactok, and they both are pretty much constants. And so next time, like I said, I'm going to be getting into this. So if you enjoyed this overview of Iara, the main character for Iara's Crossing, if you enjoyed this glimpse into this character and who she is and how she's evolved over time, feel free, again, to leave a like. Feel free to share and subscribe this video. Also, feel free to click in the description. Click on my Indiegogo page. Check it out, please. I really appreciate your support, and I need more support, need more help with this. I am really pushing to get this project out into the world. I feel that Yara, her story needs to be told and needs to be shared with all of you. And I hope that you enjoyed watching this video. I really do. I hope that wherever you are in the world, that you have a great day or evening whenever you're watching this video. And thank you so much for taking the time to stop by and watch this video on my YouTube channel. Next week, I'm going to be posting another video on Tlactok, so feel free to check that one out. And if you'd like to learn more about my Indiegogo campaign, not only check the link in the description, but also check out my previous videos. I've got a couple of videos, including the book trailer for Yara's Crossing. If you want to read a little bit more from that story, feel free to go ahead and do that. So again, thank you for sticking through this video, for watching this whole thing to the end. I really appreciate it, and I will see you next time, next video.